he probably knows all about it already.
Yeah.
All right, well, we start here. Thomas Edison was born in 1847 in a little town called Milan, Ohio. When he was about 7 years old, the family, this is his mother and his father, when they were moved to Port Huron, Michigan.
Port Huron, Michigan.
Yeah. And he was about 7 years old, and that's where he went to school, the one and only time in his life, for just 90 days. And the teacher couldn't put up with him asking so many questions, and so called his mother and said, "Take this kid out of here. There's something wrong with him. He asks too many questions." So she was a school teacher herself, retired, took him home, and she began to homeschool him.
Homeschooling.
Yeah. And before you know it, he started to do his reading and writing. He was learning very well. But these books, Natural and Experimental Philosophy, Quantitative Chemical Analysis, he was reading these by 10 years old.
Oh,
Yeah.
he's a smart guy.
Yeah, I didn't read these until I was 11.
No. He's a little smarter than you.
Yeah,
That's smart.
He was fast. Well, anyway, this book told all about the latest of technology of the time, which happened to be the telegraph. And the telegraph was invented just 10 years before he was born, 1837.
1837.
By Samuel F.B. Morse. And this book told, Quantitative Chemical Analysis, told him how to make a battery. So between the battery and this book with the telegraph, he was able to make his own unit. And he made one for his friend, and together they strung a wire between their houses, and they started sending messages at night between them, like the kids do today with the texting. Early texters.
Early texters, right, yeah.
Has it always been called Morse code?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Always been called Morse.
Oh, yeah, because it was invented by Samuel F.B. Morse.
Right.
Morse.
Yeah. And the Morse code is made up of what we call dots and dashes.
Dashes, right.
And a dot sounds like this, and a dash is longer. So most people know SOS.
That.
Dash, 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 dot, dot, dot. That sounds like this.
Right.
Okay, you can hear the rhythm of that. What's the first letter of your name?
First letter, F.
That.
There.
What's the first letter of your name?
Dot.
E? Okay.
But I know, like, in the movie, what's this, Longest Day? Remember that first thing? Dun 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 dun.
Da-da-da-da. That
Dun
one?
dun
Oh,
dun
that's,
dun. Yeah.
that's victory.
Yeah, victory.
V for victory.
Yeah.
Da-da-da-da.
Yeah, that's why in that movie you start with that.
Yeah.
Dun 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 dun.
Ah.
Yeah. That was my friend who told me, like, don't you know that's the thing, and
That's what that means.
that's why you always hear that dun 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 dun.
Yeah, good. That's also Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right?
Dun, dun, dun,
Ba-da-da-dum.
dun, 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 dun.
Okay. All right, so he learned this very well, and he loved this book, this chemistry book. And in fact, he started to buy chemicals with his allowance money. And he set up a little laboratory in his basement, and he was mixing chemicals.
He
and
burned it,
learning.
right?
And he
started a fire.
His mother smelled some odor from the basement, and so she said, "You're going to burn my house down." So she took him out of the basement, moved him into the barn,
Right.
which 2 years later he burned down,
He burned down.
the barn. So that was a good move, getting him out of the house, right?
Right.
Well, when he turned 11 years old, he said to his mother, "I think I know enough." "What do you mean enough? You're only 11 years old." He said, "I want to get a job on that new railroad that goes between
Yeah, he went to
Port Huron to Detroit. It was called the Grand Trunk Railway.
Yeah, the GT.
Okay, I know
They call it the GT now.
Yeah, GT.
Yeah.
Okay.
GT.
How could you be familiar with that from that?
Because I'm trying to trace Philippine national heroes route from San Francisco to Chicago, and then what did he take? He took the Grand Trunk, because the Grand Trunk goes all the way from Michigan. I mean, like, instead of Detroit, goes to Sarnia to Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
From Niagara Falls, you go down to New York.
Very
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I said, like, what is GT? Like, and I
Grand
saw.
Trunk. Very good.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, so he got a job on that, and his job was to sell newspapers and candy to the travelers. So he would walk up and down the rows and selling his newspapers. He was doing okay for a kid, you know. Until one day he realized, the train would go all through these fields and farmers' fields. And this was during the American Revolution, the American Civil War.
Yeah, 1862,
2, 3,
2, 3, 4. Yeah, 5 is it's already done.
Yeah.
2, 3, 4.
So they would go through these farms, and he would realize that the farmers would be selling their fruits and vegetables So he would step off the train and he realized this would be a good source. He buys the fruits and vegetables and starts selling that on the train along with the newspapers. Boy, you know, he was making more money with the fruits and vegetables than he was with the newspapers alone.
Right.
Before you know that, he started a little business. He hired 2 other boys to do the same thing. His first entrepreneurial position.
Yeah.
So he did that, and one day he asked the conductor, he says, could I have a little table like this in the baggage car? He says, sure, but for what? He says, well, he says, you know, first of all, he says, I talked to these people outside during the American Civil War, and he says, and they give me all kinds of information about what's going on and all that. And he says, I would like to write a newspaper and produce it and sell it. And he said, okay, so he gave him the desk. And he bought himself a little used printing press, and then he put out this little newspaper.
The Herald.
The Herald.
Ah.
That's the Herald. Ooh.
That's the actual size of it?
Yeah, that's it. Just a,
Wow.
okay.
He did it himself.
Yeah, and here's a picture of him setting the type on the train and all that.
Right. He
Yeah.
was doing it.
Yeah. And so the following year, he asked the conductor, he says, could I have another table like this? He says, now what? He says, well, he says, you know, when we get up to Detroit, there's a 3-hour layover before we come back. He says, and I'd like to be able to mix chemicals from my book over here. He says, I hate to waste that time. So he says, sure, all right. So he gave him the desk. So he would mix his chemicals, and he's doing this thing, and one day they must have hit some bad track and vibrated, the train vibrated, and he had a jar of phosphorus.
It burned place,
Right?
right?
And he rolled off and hits the floor of the train and up in flames.
The train.
Yeah.
The train, right.
Luckily, the conductor was there with a bucket of water, and he quickly put it out. But boy, was he mad. A young Tom almost burning down his train. So when the next stop came, the doors opened, he grabbed Tom by the 2 ears and he threw him off the train. And that's when he said he felt a pop in both ears. And
He lost his hearing.
right after that, he started to lose his hearing. When he died, he had no hearing in this ear, and he was down to about 30% in this ear.
Yeah.
So he had some hearing. But we don't know how true this whole story is about that pop and all that. Because
Could be.
he told it many, many times, and each time was a little variation to it. And also his parents both had hearing problems.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
you know, there's
It could
things,
be.
there's other kind of other factors. Anyway, he was so mad at him, he threw him off the train, and he took all his printing press, and he took all his chemical, and threw that off the train, and that was it. He was out of a job. Well, the next part of the story is young Tom was sitting at a train station, and he was sitting there, and all of a sudden he looks down, and there's a boy playing on the track. And the little boy didn't realize that a train had broken loose and was rolling towards him. And you see the brakeman up on the top trying to stop the train. Anyway, young Tom runs out there and grabs the little boy, saves his life. And just then the father of the boy came out and saw what he had done. He said, you just saved my son's life. He said, I want to give you a reward. He said, no, I don't want a reward. But he was all in uniform. He says, but you're the train master, right? He says, yes. He says, could you teach me how to be a telegraph operator? He says, I know the Morse code. I've been doing that for years, but I'd like to do this professionally. He says, sure, you saved my son's life. I'd be glad to do that. So this man, Mr. McKenzie, he invited young Tom to come live with him for 1 year, because he was only 14 years old by that time. And he brought him to work every day and showed him the proper operation, how to become a real professional. So when he turned 15 years old, he got a job with Western Union, and as a temporary telegrapher. Telegrapher, yeah. And so as a temporary, he would go here, then they'd move him here, and wherever they needed somebody to fill in, that was his job. They call it itinerant telegrapher, that's what it's called. So he did that for about 6 years, jumping around, learning about all different kinds of telegraph systems and all that. Really a learning process. When he turned 21 years old, he wound up in Boston, Massachusetts. And in Boston, Massachusetts, he made the conscious decision that he no longer wanted to be just a telegraph operator. He now wanted to be a full-time inventor. So he invents this machine, which was called the vote recorder. And it was meant for the Massachusetts legislature, so that when they voted on a bill, all they had to do was push one of the 2 buttons on their desk, a yay or a nay, yes or a no. Very simple. Well, he installed the buttons at all the senators' desks, but they used it, and at the end of the first day, it came out of a closed door meeting. They said, We didn't like it. Why not? Did it work? Oh yeah, it worked, but we didn't like it. But why didn't you like it? He says, it was too fast. How could anything be too fast? He says, well, you see, this is not the way we do business. You see, once you push that button, that's it. You recorded your vote.
Right.
We don't do
If
it
you
that
change
way.
your mind.
Yeah, we come up here at the last second and try to get you to change your vote. You already voted, see? It's too fast. Okay, so he figured it out. He says, I will never again invent something that people don't need or want. So it was a very good lesson for him with his first invention. So with that, he jumps on a steamboat and comes down to New York City, where he had a friend of his who was working at the gold exchange on Wall Street. And he went down there and he walks in and the men were trading gold and buying and selling, and it was exciting. 21-year-old kid, really exciting. And then all of a sudden, the men started to scream, and he asked the guy next to him, what's going on? He says, oh, that machine probably broke again. Oh, machine, huh? He loved machines, so he worked through the crowd and he spots the machine. It was a little device with a glass top. It was like a gumball cup. He took the cover off that and he's looking and he's looking. He saw the problem right away. A little spring jumped off. He put the spring back on where it belonged and the machine started to work. And he puts the cover on, he turns around, and who's behind him but the boss? The boss said, I saw what you did. You know how to fix these? He says, yes, sir. He said, I want to offer you a job. $350 a month to maintain that machine.
Big
Oh,
money.
that was big money, but he says, a very important job to maintain it. So he said, okay, I'll take it. So he did that for a while, and he was working in New York. But he wasn't the kind of guy at the end of the day, 9 to 5, to go home and sit around and read the sports page, So he would come home, and instead of doing that, he came across from New York to New Jersey, and he opened up a factory up in Newark, right by the train station in Newark. And it was there that he had all these people working for him.
Wow.
And they were making things mainly for the telegraph industry. Other things, fire alarms and stuff like that, but mainly for the telegraph industry.
Sort of subcontracting, huh?
Subcontracting, I don't know about that, but he was selling the parts and pieces.
I see.
Oh,
A
yeah.
vendor.
So,
He
Okay.
was creating that. Yeah. So anyway, so he was doing very well. He was making money. He invents this thing here, which was called the quadruplex. And what that did was, Western Union was a fledgling company at the time, and they really couldn't expand much more because they were using the telegraph wires that were along the tracks for the trains, and the trains need that. They need that telegraph wire too, so they could only send messages in between railroad transmissions. So he came up with an idea how to multiplex or make 4 transmissions on one wire. He called it the quadruplex.
Quadruplex.
And so that revolutionized everything. So now the railroad could use their own wire, and they had 3 additional wires they could use, rent out or whatever.
For other things,
For other
right.
things. And so Western Union, who was the biggest player at the time, started to buy up everything and anything they could get, and he was making a lot of money. He was doing very, very well, the quadruplex. And it was there in this location up in Newark that he meets this little girl who was working for him. He had a fancy for her, and he proposes to her, and they get married.
How?
She was
Oh,
16 years
She was
old.
16, but he was in his 20s.
20,
right?
I think, 20, 21.
21.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And-
and she was younger.
Yeah. And they had 3 children. This was Marion. This is Thomas Alva Edison Jr.
Junior.
And this was William Leslie. The first 2 were born up in Newark. William Leslie was born here in Menlo Park. Now, where does Menlo Park come from? He was getting tired of Newark and the noisy, dirty city, and he asked around. He says, anybody here know where we could move to? He said, I'd like to get out of the city. And somebody who lived in the next town of Metuchen said, I know a place you might be interested in. It's called Menlo Park. Oh, really? He says, what's that? Well, he says, it's a failed housing development. They planned on building houses, but they couldn't sell them because of the downturn in the economy. And he says, and it's right on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Did you see the railroad down below?
Yeah,
It's
that's
right
right.
on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Oh, when he heard railroad, he spent half his life on the railroad. He said, oh, I'm interested. So he comes down here, and he gets off the train down below, and he walks up this hill. This is called Christie Street. And outside where you see that piece of land with the tower on it, He said, that's the spot I want to build my laboratory. So outside, where that tower is now, that is the spot that
That's
he
the
built
spot.
his laboratory. So here's the laboratory that was built right there. Okay? This little white building, that's the building we happen to be in right now. But you notice that building is right on top of what used to be the machine shop. So the machine shop was right here. And that's where they were able to fabricate any parts or pieces that he needed.
So which one is Christie Street?
This
now?
is Christie.
This is Christie
This is Christie,
Street.
yeah. Yeah. So from where we're at here, this building, if you look directly across the street, you see there's a billboard, and that billboard signifies where Edison started his experimental electric train from. Okay? And I'll tell you about that in the back. This is his office. All these buildings are gone, but this building and this building were made of bricks. And I'll tell you in a minute. But this building here was a little shed out in the backyard that they used. He used to make carbon, and he had these kerosene lamps in it. And he purposely turned the wicks up real high, that in the glass chimney they get all black with soot. Well, he knew that that soot was pure carbon. So he'd send somebody out there every day to scrape that carbon out and bring it into the laboratory, and he used that carbon in his experiments. Very important little shed. As you can see, there are no buildings left here. Well, it's well over 100 years, but Edison was only here for about 6.5 years until his young wife passes away. And she passed away. She passed away because she had these terrible headaches. They didn't know what to do for her, so they didn't even have aspirin yet, but they might have been migraine headaches.
Could be.
Could be. But they gave her morphine to kill the pain. And
Yeah.
that's what happened. And she overdosed on that. So anyway, so he comes up here and he spots this piece of land out here and says, this is the spot I want to build my laboratory. So he walks down the hill, and on the left-hand side was this building, this house, all the way down on the corner. And he goes in there, and that was the corporate headquarters for the Menlo Park Association. And so he goes in there and he says, I'd like to buy this land that I hear is for sale. And he says, yeah, he says, but the house comes with it. Oh, okay. So by this time he was doing well. He had a lot of money, and he bought the land and the house for $5,200. Not bad, right?
But in those days,
Yeah,
that's
it's a lot of money.
big money.
Sure. But he did very well with that. So he
Can you imagine how many blocks is that? That's you from
Oh yeah, yeah. It's
Pacific
36,
Avenue.
36 acres.
36
And it had already been all cleared. There were no trees. All the roads were already in, like that.
All the roads are in,
Yeah.
and it's
And
already
Already
subdivided.
named and everything, yeah, just what, and,
Where's the house located? Somewhere by Pennsylvania?
yeah,
right?
I'd have to get my glasses to show. I'll show you after, but I'll have to
Okay.
get my glasses on for that. Anyway, so they planned on building a home on each one of those little squares, like a lot. Anyway, so he buys the property. This is the house. That house was down our corner, just to the left. It's gone. It burned down in 1917. And William Leslie was born there just a few months later. Okay? And so he finally moves into his new building, and he starts to work. And great things came out of it, which I'll tell you all about as we go in the back. Okay, so after his wife died, he packed up his children, because now he was a bachelor, and he was a workaholic, so he wanted to work. And so he brought his children to New York City, where he was already at this point working on the lighting system downtown in Manhattan.
In Manhattan.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he goes. He takes the children to New York, and did not come back here until 1925. Many
years.
Yeah. And he only came back, and here he was as an old man. He came back because they put up this. They commissioned this monument, which is right down our street, Christie Street, just to the left. And you can. It's on there. It's there, and it's on Route 27, so it's only 2 blocks down. But if you were to see that, right back here is where the house was. Okay, right behind. That would have been on the front lawn, actually. Okay. Okay.
So when he went back to New York City, what became of the properties here?
Well, that's what happened. He once he lost his wife. Within 2 years, he was remarried, and the neighbors knew he wasn't going to come back because they read it in the newspaper. He bought a piece of property up in West Orange, started building a laboratory up there, and they knew he wasn't coming back.
So essentially, the operations here have
Oh,
shut
it
down.
totally stopped, yeah.
Okay.
So little at a time, the locals occupied the buildings. The main building here, they moved their animals into the ground floor, and they
Oh, it's just like a barn or
like a
something?
barn.
Right.
The top floor was a single floor.
Single floor.
They made a dance hall out of it, and and used it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And little at a time, as it got cold, they would rip the boards off the building and throw it into the fireplace to keep warm. Before you know it, they burned everything down.
Burn everything.
I
down.
mentioned this was brick and this was brick because what happened to the brick buildings? Well, the neighbors blew up the buildings to use the bricks, to reuse the bricks. They made chimneys and stairs and fireplaces. They knew he wasn't coming back.
Right.
So they utilized it, repurposed it.
Did
Did
the
you
pro-
get the
did-
money out of it or
No,
something?
no. It was donated back to the state.
Oh,
Later on.
back to the state.
Yeah. So that's basically it. But so 1925 is when he came back here the last time that we know of. And 4 years later happened to be the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the light bulb. And so they made Henry Ford made a big museum out in Dearborn, Michigan. And Thomas Edison was out there with his friend Henry Ford on this 50th anniversary. And what they did is Henry Ford recreated this village out there as the center point of his museum.
Okay,
So it's exactly as you see this
That one was
out there in Michigan.
I see.
Oh, in Michigan. What part of Michigan is that?
Dearborn, Michigan,
Dearborn.
right outside of Detroit.
Okay, yeah, because the Ford company
Yeah, of
was
course,
in
that's
there.
where nearest headquarters.
It's-
So Ford expanded it, and it's a beautiful place to go. Oh, it's wonderful. You see that, but there's 1,000 other things. You see the Wright Brothers factory.
Oh, yeah,
You see
Orville.
Orville, and you can see where the bicycle factory, where they, the store where they sold the tires and all that.
Yeah, the tires.
It's great to see. It's a great place to go. Anyway, so this was 50 years after he invented the light bulb here, and on that day it was such a big occasion that the President of the United States was there upstairs waiting for him, for Edison.
1929?
1929.
Who was the president then?
I don't know. Hayes?
29?
Hayes?
Hayes?
Oh, 79.
No.
No, Hayes.
1929.
Oh, 1929, that's Hoover.
That's Hoover.
Yeah.
That's already part of the Depression, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it depends when in 29.
29 is the early part.
October 29.
Depression was October,
October.
Well, this is October 21st. That was the.
so it was right by it.
Yeah.
Right by it.
When was Black Friday?
It's like October 25th, 9th or something
Well,
like that.
4 days, 5 days, later.
5 days
later.
before. Yeah, 5 days later.
There you go.
Yeah, 5 days.
All hell broke loose, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, so
A lot of people hang themselves, right?
oh yeah,
Because they like
jumped out of windows.
jump in their windows. They're like, ooh, depression.
So anyway, so this was 1929, and here at Menlo Park, there was a tower erected on that same spot
Mm-hmm.
over here
Right there.
by the Edison Pioneers. This was a group of ex-employees and people that loved Edison, and they pooled money and they built this tower on the same spot where you see this tower, and on the top there was a light bulb. And Edison out in Michigan pushed a button and lit the light on top of this.
He was in Michigan and lit it up here.
Can you imagine doing that back then?
That is high tech in those days.
Today you could do that with easy ease with the internet, but without an internet.
I control my cell phone
Yeah,
with my
anywhere in
cell-
the world, right?
I control my camera with my cell phone.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal, so they turned that on.
That's a big invention. Yeah.
So that was 1929, and he died just 2 years later at age 84 in
But
1931.
that's long life.
Oh,
in
that was
those
a long
days.
life, a very fruitful life.
Right.
Very.
Because people die at what, 50?
Oh, 20s, 30s.
20s, 30s, yeah.
His wife died, she was 20 something, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so that was basically the story of the tower. But that tower came down a few years later in a storm. And Then they rebuilt the tower that you see there now in 1938 and made this one out of concrete, so it's
So this is originally a 1938.
yes,
built.
that is the tower from 1938. It just finished a major renovation, and it was reopened last October.
Oh, they renovated.
2 years it took to renovate it, but now it's beautiful. Okay, so that takes care of this. Now on this wall here, Edison became so well known in everything he did. He was an original member of the IEEE, if you're into computers or...
He knows that.
The headquarters of that is in Piscataway.
Piscataway, that's right.
Piscataway.
Originally, Edison was one of the charter members.
Right.
And at that time, it was called the AIEE, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers.
Oh, electrical engineers.
And then later, it was changed to I for International, and then
Electrical.
more recently, they added and computing. Yeah.
So
We are a milestone site. That's a very important thing for us, this site.
I think they're sort of like, they set the standards globally.
Oh, yeah, that's
for
what the
like
standards are.
Ethernet wires, USB.
Well, every standard,
every standard is
yes,
still there.
Yes, yeah.
goes through them. Yeah.
So this is only 2006.
So Edison, of course, became very famous, and they made coins, and they made stamps,
Yeah,
and they,
right.
you know,
They made stamps.
stamps.
I remember. See, but this is
That was
1947.
1947, sure.
Older than me.
Older than you? Really?
I'm 1949.
I'm older than you. I'm way older than you. All right. So anyway, so he became very, very famous, world famous. But the biggest honor, if he was long gone, they changed the township of Raritan, which is what this was, and they changed it to the township of Edison in 1950.
So this was originally called Raritan.
Raritan, after the Raritan River, which is right here.
Raritan River.
Yeah. But at that time, there was a North Raritan, South Raritan, West Raritan, whatever, and so they decided to change the Raritan,
Edison.
because it was very confusing, and mail would go to the wrong place.
1954.
54.
Oh, we were already around in 54.
Sure.
I was 5 years old in
Oh, yeah.
54.
There you go. There you go. So anyway, so that's the story on here.
Yeah, but you know, like the life of Edison is always a lesson in elementary school.
Oh, sure.
When I was in
Sure.
elementary school, I remember that.
There's far more interested in internationally than there is in American schools. Very, very little is told about Thomas Edison in American schools.
Yeah, but going back to his loss of hearing,
Yeah.
you said they pulled him up. I remember specific somebody boxed him in the ear,
Well,
but it could be.
Boxing doesn't mean that. In those days, they meant boxing was like this.
Oh, yeah.
So they went.
That one would even.
Yeah, the concussion.
Concussion. Yeah, right.
But it's written so many different ways. He told the story so many different ways. We don't even know if that's what caused it. But, you know, that's what he did.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, so this is a bust of Thomas Edison. He was 5'9.5" tall.
So you really patterned it after that height.
Yeah.
This one is
That's
5'9",
exact-
right?
Yeah, that's 5'9".
Yeah, I'm
5'9".
five
Yeah, that was
six.
5'9.5". Yeah, you shrunk a little bit since
I'm shrunk a little.
1947.
1949.
49. Yeah.
49, I'm shrunk.
I used to be 6'2".
I think it'll start now more. Like, so, see, like I'm 67 now.
Yeah. All right. So this was a book, very interesting part, that he was told by his patent attorney to keep this book in his pocket at all times. He says, if you're ever out in the field, he says, don't wait till you come back to the office to write up an idea. He says, you write your idea in this little book, and you get somebody to sign their name, put a time and date as a witness that they saw you invent this, and that'll stand up in court should you need it. See, they sew the pages in, so you can't take the pages in around.
Right.
So he says, so that's what you do. He says, okay. So he carried these around, and he left thousands of these behind, all written.
Really?
Yeah, thousands of them. Yeah, and so there were 3 occasions where he was challenged. He was challenged constantly on his patents, but there were 3 occasions where he was challenged, and there was an earlier entry in here than there was in than the person that was challenging. So there was an earlier entry. Here.
Oh, yeah, because it was the date all the
Yeah,
time.
that's right. And I always tell this story. And one time I told the story, and I had this big guy standing right here, and I got finished telling him about the book, you know, blah, blah, and the man goes like this. He says, I work for IBM and we have to carry one. How about that? So,
Oh, well, that's the idea.
yeah. And we sell them in the bookstore here for our up-and-coming inventors, you know?
You know, I'm going to buy some,
All right,
I'll give
there
you
you
a
go,
Paul.
there you go. Good
That's
idea.
the best thing.
This
He
is-
loves things like that.
This is one of the very few things we have that actually belonged to Thomas Edison. This was his eyepiece, his jeweler's
yeah,
loop board.
jeweler's, right.
Yeah, it's a little magnifier for
Yeah, I
small.
got one at home. Somebody gave it to me, the old
Yeah.
one.
And so we put this in this box because we don't want anybody to touch it. 'Cause
Yeah.
Edison was
Of
the
course.
last one to use it. And so there still may be a little of his DNA around the edge.
Could be.
And if you've seen that movie, Jurassic Park, we might want to bring him back someday.
Right, who knows? Yep, that's how things are.
All right, we're going to go in the back now. This is a great chart, though, to see. You can take a picture of this. That in Edison's lifetime, these were all his years of his inventions.
Inventions?
He had 1,093 patents, American patents.
American patent.
1,250 foreign patents, and still holds the record of any single man.
Inventions.
Yep. And this little spot here is where he was here from 1876 to 1883. This 6.5 year period here, he had a
invented-
spike of 400. So he had 400 that came out of this laboratory, and he had 700 for the entire rest of his life. Wow. So that's
Wow,
what his.
that's a lot. And these are some of them.
This is 20 of these 400.
20 of
Of
these
these
400
400.
inventions.
Yep. And it's, you know, it's the light bulb and the.
Oh yeah, the light
The
bulbs.
phonograph.
Oh, I always like associate it with the light bulb.
Yeah, yeah.
Hello. Hi, how you doing?
See one thing nice about this new camera? You can always do it like this. You're in it, I don't have to worry about it.
Let's see if
It's
we
very nice.
people join us here.
Yeah,
They're gonna join us.
they can join us.
Oh, there? Hello. Hello.
My friend got one like this.
Yeah, okay. We're gonna go through those. All right, come on back here. The front half of the museum, we talk about Edison's younger days, and this part is when he actually came here to Menlo Park. Okay, and then of course I repeat this back. My wife says I do this in my sleep. Okay, first of all, I'd like to show you this photograph and this model. See this model? That is a model of the laboratory that was outside where the tower is now. Okay? And, oh, we have some more people coming in here. Let me hold up because I don't have to repeat this 14 times. Just see if they join us. Maybe not going to do this. Okay, so if I can have your attention, right? So this is a model of the laboratory that was outside where the tower is now. This is where he operated. And this model was given to Thomas Edison. Come here, you can take a picture of this. Thomas Edison and his second wife, Minor Miller, in 1922. It was given to them in New York City. But the significance of this model is the model was made from the scraps of wood from the original building. Oh, there you go.
That's nice.
That's about all we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been training on.
Okay.
So somebody.
Very, very
Yeah,
important.
very important.
You know, that's the centerpiece of the whole museum. All the buildings are gone because it's well over 100 years. The neighbors knew he moved away, and they started ripping the boards off and put it in the furnace. You know, it's a shame, but that's what happened to.
So they
all
didn't
history.
use the McDonald's sticks to stir coffee, right?
No. But Henry Ford, who was his good friend, was building a museum out in Michigan. And he came here thinking he was going to pick up all the old buildings, and he got here. He was surprised. There were no buildings then. They had already destroyed everything. So what he did was he heard that the brick, he had an office, was made of bricks, and a building was made out of the machine shop was also made out of bricks. They were both gone. He said, well, what happened to this? Well, the neighbors blew them up, and they reused the bricks and made, they made the steps, and chimneys and fireplaces and all that. So Henry Ford, he couldn't believe that. So he walked around the neighborhood. He said, "You wouldn't happen to have any bricks that came out of Edison's?" "Yeah, I put them in this fireplace." And he had somebody come back in and rebuild the fireplace, but took out the bricks, the original bricks. And he brought those bricks out to Michigan.
So he wants the real bricks.
He wants the real thing. So he did as much of that as possible and rebuilt the same area out there in Michigan. He did such a phenomenal job that he recreated it from photographs and everything. But he had them come here and scrape off the top layer of dirt off the site. And he took 7 train carloads of dirt, New Jersey dirt, off the top of this, put it on the train down below, brought it out to Michigan, and before he recreated his little village, they spread 1 inch of New Jersey dirt on that spot to make it as authentic as possible. And then they even built the buildings so that they aligned with where the sun would come up in New Jersey and where the sun would come up in Michigan. Trying to make it as exact as possible. And as the story goes, we don't know how true the story is, but the story was on opening day of the museum out there, Edison was picked up by Henry Ford on the train. And he drove him around, and everybody upstairs, the buildings, this is the building. Upstairs was the President of the United States. Madame Curie came in from Europe. The Rockefellers, anybody that was anybody was upstairs waiting for him. And so Edison was picked up by Ford. They drove right to the front, and he went inside, and he saw the bottles on the wall, just the way he had left it, from photographs. And he was really amazed, but I mean, he was saying he was looking around, showing Edison, and Edison didn't say a word. And typically he was a jokester. He always had something funny to say, but he didn't have a thing to say after seeing all the buildings. And well, he finally got upstairs in front of the president. He said, "Well, Mr. Edison, you didn't say anything. What do you think of my recreation?" He says, "Nah, it's not the same." "It's not. What's wrong with it?" He says, "It's too clean." So he was a jokester after all. So that was the story on being out in Michigan. Okay, so you saw that. I want to show you something over here before we go into the phonograph itself. This was a very early phonograph. Not the first one. I have the first one over there. This was the very early, but it's easy to point out a few things. This big bronze, brass, whatever it is, a drum, is called the drum, for obvious reasons. Wrapped around the drum, which looks like aluminum foil, is really tin foil. The original phonographs were called tin foil phonographs. It was a little thicker, a little bit more durable.
Is that before the wax ones?
Oh yeah, this one here is actually wax. And thirdly, this thing here in the front, that black thing, is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm was both the microphone and the playback all in one. Okay? Now that you've seen that, now we can talk about this one. Come on over here so you can see right in front of you. So Edison moves into his brand new building, that building out there, the model. He moves into it, and it's all empty, it's got all his men are ready to work, and he's thinking, what am I going to work on first? Now, when he was a young boy, he learned Morse code and worked for Western Union and so forth as a telegraph operator. So he always wanted to record Morse code so that he could record it at some high speed and then play it back at some slow speed so that some poor operator could copy the code without it being so fast. So he took something that looked like a CD, of course it wasn't, and he took something with a sharp needle and scratched in a dot and a dash and a dot and a dash, scratching it onto the CD. And accidentally, the needle slipped and went zip, and he heard that sound. He said, "Whoa, what's that sound?" And all of a sudden, he figured it out. And he grabbed the diagram. He grabbed a piece of paper and drew this diagram. And he took the diagram, he handed it over to Mr. Cruci, and he said, "Mr. Cruci, build me one of these." Now, Mr. Cruci was from Switzerland. He was a fine machinist. He could make anything. And he worked in this machine shop. This is a picture from the machine shop.
That's the machine shop.
That is the machine shop. And it was right here on this line. Okay? And Mr. Cruci looked at the diagram. He said, "Well, what the heck is it?" He says, "It's my talking machine." Oh, when he said that, all the guys stopped. Like, what? Talking machine? This was the 1800s. Machines didn't talk.
Don't talk.
Not like today. Everything talks today, right? So he said, all right. So Mr. Cruci takes the diagram and he goes into the machine shop. And 3 days later, he comes back with this. And everybody said, "That's it? That's the talking machine?" "Yep, that's it." Well, they all wanted to hear it talk, wouldn't you, if you worked there? So he says, all right, go get me a piece of that tin foil. So he got the tin foil and he wrapped it around that drum. And then this thing in the front, I called it the diaphragm. Now what that is in the round circle, there was a very thin piece of material in the back. When I speak, the vibrations from my throat move the air between me and you, it vibrates your eardrum, and that's how you hear me. Well, by the same token, when I speak, it would vibrate this diaphragm to vibrate with my voice. So he took a needle, stuck the needle through the center of that, so that every time I speak, the needle would vibrate with the diaphragm. He turned it around this way, put the needle up against the tin foil on the drum. He got down on his knees. He spoke into there as he cranked the handle. He said, Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. And anywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
Yeah.
And everybody was looking at her real strange, like, you know? And he moves this thing back to the beginning. And he starts cranking the handle. And all of a sudden, the machine says, Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white. Wow, they couldn't believe what they had just heard. This was the first time the human voice had ever been recorded and played back. Right outside where that tower is now, that's the spot that it happened. Wow, they looked at each other, they couldn't believe it. Well, his first thought was, this baby's going to get me into my retirement. He knew he was going to make money with it. But then he started to second guess himself. Who's going to spend money to say Mary had a little lamb? I mean, it's just not that important, you know? So he got a patent on it. And he showed it around, he took it all over, everybody was really impressed with it. In fact, there was a newspaper in New York, they had a front page, and they called him the Wizard of Menlo Park. Anybody who can make a machine that talks has to be a wizard. So he was the wizard. Anyway, so he is just about ready to put this aside because he had other things to work on. He's pushing this thing aside, and all of a sudden, a young boy comes to the door and says, Mr. Edison, today's my first day on the job as a newspaper reporter, and I would like to interview you. Well, normally he would say, no, you need an appointment, but the kid was 15 years old, so he said, okay. So the kid comes in, and he says, Mr. Edison, can I ask you this? Why did you say Mary had a little lamb in the very first recording? Edison said, well, had I known it was going to work the first time, I would have said something more important. But he didn't know, right? Yeah, all right. Anyway, so he pushes this thing aside and never touches it again for 10 years. Ooh. Other people were working on it, improving it and everything else, like you said, with the wax and all that. That was an improvement. And he would get royalties for this, or for everything had to do with his phonograph. But he didn't have anything to do with it himself. So he pushed that aside and went to work on his next creation, which was the light bulb. And we're very careful to say here that Edison did not invent the light bulb. He perfected the light bulb. It was a big difference. And so Edison, before Edison was born, people were making bulbs like this, you know, glass bulbs, and they were putting filaments inside, just like that filament is lit there, just like that. But the problem was they wouldn't stay lit for more than a couple of seconds and burn out, burn out, burn out. So when Edison started, he thought, oh, they just didn't know what they were doing. Wow. He found out after trying 10,000 different filaments. Imagine the persistence of anybody going that many. 10,000. He says, there's got to be more to it than this. Something I'm overlooking. He thought about it and figured it out. What he had a glass blower here that was here from Germany. And he had him blow this glass. He says, but I want you to make me a new glass bulb. But this time, I want you to have a straw sticking out of the top of it. He said, okay. So he made the bulb, they put the filament inside, and at the very top of the straw, he put a pump to suck the air out of the bulb. Because his thought was that inside the bulb was this air that we breathe. And part of the air that we breathe is 20% oxygen, is what we breathe every day. And he felt that that oxygen supports the burning and causing it to burn out. And he was absolutely right. So by putting that pump on the top to suck the air out of it, he created a vacuum inside. When he couldn't get any more air out of it, he lit up a torch, and at the end of the glass, and right at the top of the bulb, he hit that with the torch. When it turned white hot, he twisted that and sealed the vacuum in. And that's what that little tip is on the top of all the old bulbs. That's where he actually sealed it. And now he comes over and he connects it to his battery. And instead of it lasting for just 2 seconds, this time it lasted for 14 and a half hours. And he went, yes, I got it. And that was the secret, the vacuum. So yes, the filament was very important, but the vacuum was the most important thing. So he said, we're not going to say a thing about this to anybody until it's fully perfected, that we can repeat this. Anybody could do it once, you know. So it took them 2 months from the end of October of 1879 to the end of December of 1879. When he was satisfied, he put an ad in a New York paper saying that Edison had perfected the light bulb, and anyone wishing to see it is welcome to come here to Menlo Park on New Year's Eve at 11:30 at night. So he told his men, you sort of missed this, but he had a shed out in the backyard with kerosene lamps in it that he used to make carbon with from the soot that accumulated in the top. So he told his men, go to the shed, get the kerosene lamps, go out to Christie Street, walk all the way down to the train. Did you see the train down below, the train tracks? Well, there's a set of train tracks, it's still there. That was called the Pennsylvania Railroad at the time. He says, go down there and wait and see if anybody shows up from New York. So they go down there, and sure enough, the train pulls in at 11:30 at night, stops right there. There's no station, it just stops in the middle of nowhere. And the men are waiting there with the kerosene lamps, and all of a sudden the doors open. 3,000 people got off the train that wanted to see the light bulb. Wow, so they're walking the people up the street with the kerosene lamps, you know. And right about here, this was the edge of the machine shop, right here. Right about here, there was a pathway from the street, and 3,000 people assembled right on the spot where you are. And just before midnight, he had this generator in the front end of this machine shop, and it was being turned by a steam engine. And he just before midnight, he walked over to it, and he went like this. And not one bulb, but 100 bulbs came on, every window, every doorway. It was like a miniature city. It was unbelievable. They expected to see a little bulb. They didn't expect to see this. It was unbelievable. Yep. And so, they were so thrilled that people were touching the bulb and finding it was hot, you know. They didn't know what to expect. So it was unbelievable. So anyway, it was now about an hour later. It was a cold winter night, and they started to leave. And as they walked out to Christie Street and they started to walk down towards the train, they realized that Edison had installed street lights all the way down the street, right up to the train. This was the first street in the entire world to have electric lights on it, incandescent lights on it. So, anyway, by the way, the name of the street is Christie Street, but it has nothing to do with the name of our present governor. He gets no credit for this whatsoever.
No, Governor Christie.
Okay. All right, so that's the story on that. The next, now, remember, he was only here on this site for 6.5 years. But all these stories, they happen one on top of the other. You know, one didn't stop and the other started. So anyway, here's this picture of, there's a picture of a piece of track that he thought to himself, why can't trains run on electricity? And so what did he do? He had them build a test track from across the street. There's a billboard. Right at that billboard, they built a 2.5-mile test track into the next town that will touch it. And then he built himself a train. The cover picture there is of the train. And he took this generator and the 2 wires, the plus and the minus, which was in the front of the building, which was right here. They dug a hole underneath the street. They attached the plus to one side of the track and the minus to the other side of the track. When he put that train on the track and the 2 steel wheels touched the tracks, when this steel wheel touched the plus and that one touched the minus, the train moved forward. When they got to the end, they would pull the stick back, reverse the polarity on the wheels, and the train would back up. But to prove that this thing could move people, he loaded 98 people on the train, got it up to 45 miles an hour using that generator. All right? It was an experiment just to see if it would work. Of course, today, all trains are electric, one way or the other, whether you got wires over the top of your head, or like in New York, we have the 3rd rail for the subway. You know, even if it's a diesel train, it's a diesel engine that's turning a generator, creating electricity that goes to the wheels. So everything is electric today because of Thomas Edison. Okay? All right. So the next story I want to tell you about is here. It's about the telephone. Does anybody remember who invented the telephone? Graham Bell. Oh, I always forget that. Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell got a patent for the first telephone. but it didn't work very well. You would scream in the microphone and just barely hear it the other end. It just wasn't very good. It worked well enough just to get the patent, but that's about it. So about a year after he got the patent, he comes down here to see Thomas Edison. They knew each other. They both worked as telegraph operators up in Boston. So he comes down here and he says, you know, I got the patent for the telephone, but he says, it doesn't work very well. He says, yes, I heard that. He says, but I have just what you need. He says, I invented this, the carbon button microphone. This was a very sensitive microphone. And this, you know, I said the word carbon, the carbon button. You know where the carbon came from? That shed in the back with all those kerosene lamps. He scraped that out, and that's the kerosene. That's the carbon that's in the top, in the glass top. So in there is the carbon, and he makes this very sensitive microphone. He takes this microphone, connects it to Bell's telephone, and now you know we can speak anywhere in the world because of this. And now, no matter where you've come from, no matter where you are, if you're over a certain age, this was in the mouthpiece of your telephone, no matter what country you came from, right? In the Philippines, no matter where, all over the world.
All sounds.
This, they sold billions and billions and billions of these from 1879 to 1979, 100 years. That was in every phone, every place in the world. Imagine that. What can you buy today that lasts 100 years? You buy a computer, 3 months later you got to throw it out and buy another one, right? And by the way, this was sort of an ongoing feud between Bell and Edison about the telephone. So you know how Bell used to answer his telephone when it rang? He used to say, "Ahoy!" as if he was on a ship. Edison didn't like that. He came up with his own word, "Hello."
Oh, he was the one who started it.
He's the one that started it.
Hello.
Yeah. And so, so they argued over this for years. Hello, ahoy, hello, ahoy, you know. Well, it happened that poor Bell died first. And that's why we say hello. That's the way it works. Anyway, so that's the story on the telephone. The next part of the story is, I already told this part in the front, is that his young wife passed away. They were only married a short time, but she passed away. And he moved out of New Jersey, out of here. He moved his kids to New York City and got himself a nanny to take care of the kids. Some of his friends thought he shouldn't be alone, he should be a married man. And so they started inviting him up to Boston, and they promenaded these beautiful women past him, like you know, debutantes of the day. And one of them struck his fancy. Her name was Mina Miller, and she's the lady that's in that photograph many, many years later. But they wound up getting married. Within 2 years, they were each remarried. And he asked her, where would you like to live? Would you like to go back to Menlo Park? Well, she didn't want to have anything to do with this. The first wife was here, didn't want to have anything to do with it. Now this lady, she came from wealth, some sort of wealth. Her father, too, was an inventor, not quite as famous as Thomas Edison, but he made farm equipment and stuff. And she was college educated, so she was quite a gal. I mean, he only had 3 months of training of schooling in his whole life. But anyway, so she complimented, when they finally got married, she really complimented him, you know, in every way. She helped him in every way possible. Anyway, so they got married, and he buys a house for her up in West Orange, New Jersey. You familiar with West Orange? The second half of his life. Okay, so he was here for 6.5 years, and he spent the next 45 years up in West Orange, which is the rest of his life. He died there in that house, and he's buried in the backyard. He moves up to that building, to the house. It happened to be a mansion. There was a mansion from the day. It had like 8 bedrooms. It was beautiful. In fact, it came fully furnished with furniture from all over Europe, and Persian rugs, and paintings from the masters and Edison's. And he bought it as a repossession from the bank. And he said, well, why does the bank have a house like this? Nah, they said the owner couldn't pay the mortgage anymore. Oh, really? What did the owner do? He said, he used to be a bookkeeper. Bookkeeper. He said, how does a bookkeeper afford a house like this? He was getting in trouble because he was embezzling his employer. That's how he bought all this great stuff. Well, Edison wound up buying the whole place for $175,000, which doesn't sound like much today, but that's about $4.5 million.
$4.5 million.
Yeah, in today's money. But he had it and he bought it. And that house is still there, and you can go on a tour of that. It's a fabulous tour. And right down the street, a piece of property became available, and he bought it. And I think it was 19 acres, and it was on that 19 acres he built his next laboratory. And you could go there and go on a tour of that. So anyway, so the next part of the story is once he gets into the next laboratory up in West Orange, he starts thinking to himself, what am I going to work on first? When he first moved into this building over here, remember he said, what am I going to work on first? He worked on that Morse code thing, which led him to the phonograph. Well, he thought to himself, he says, what am I going to work on first in my new laboratory? And he thought about it, and all of a sudden he says, hey, it's been 10 years since I worked on my own phonograph. Everybody else has had an awful lot of fun with it, and I would like to start working on it again. So sure enough, he decides that's what he's going to do. So he goes to work, and in 1898, this was the first phonograph to come out of his new laboratory. I'm going to play this for you. It's 115 years old. The recording on here is 115 years old. And now, after all these many years, what you said about the wax, that was the big advancement in this from the original. Now, the original was made with the tin foil, and 10 years later, now the state of the art was this wax cylinder. And the wax cylinder was, of course, hello ladies, the wax cylinder replaced the original tin foil. But you'll never guess who invented the blue wax cylinder that we talk about. Alexander Graham Bell, his competitor, right? So, just as he recorded on that tin foil originally, well, the tin foil you're only able to record on it once or twice and play it back once or twice because the needle actually cut into the tin foil and it actually destroyed it. So after just one or two plays, it was destroyed. And so when Bell came up with this was a big improvement. Now Bell did this because Bell and his family was very much into the hard of hearing, and they knew this made it louder and better. So anyway, so he created this. So I'm about to play this for you. Anybody's got video, now's the time to pull out the cameras, audio, video, whatever you want. I used to do this, and when I get all done, everybody would pull out the cameras. I had to do it again. Now I tell you in advance. All right, got it? Ready? Okay.
Ready.
So this is a 115-year-old phonograph. It's strictly a wind-up machine. There's no electricity. This horn focuses the sound, makes it sound louder, even though it's not really any louder. So I release the spring, which makes this thing turn. This is the diaphragm that we keep talking about. Underneath there is a needle. When I put the needle down, right about here.
So he tells you, yes, we have a no bananas. We have a no bananas today. With string beans and onions, cabbages and scallions, and all kinds of fruit and say. We have an old-fashioned tomato, a Long Island potato, but yes, we have a no banana. We have a no bananas today.
So how was that for 115 years old?
That's great.
Not bad, right?
Yeah, fair.
Well, somebody said to Thomas Edison, oh, that was great. Can I have a copy of that song about the bananas? A copy? No, we don't make copies. You see, each one was an original. And they would actually, the guy would sing in there, they put a special needle on here, and it would engrave itself onto a brand new cylinder. So he thought about it. He said, boy, that is a good idea. And he thought about it. He figured it out. I make it sound fast, but it took him 2 years to figure it out how to do it. But he took this blue wax cylinder, and he gold-plated it, made a mold out of it. And then he put hot wax inside the mold. When it cooled off, he pulled it out, and he had an exact copy of this original. And what did he do? He went into business selling Edison gold-molded records.
He liked to put his name on stuff.
Everything. His name was on absolutely everything. See? The gold-molded records. So now if you like that song, you could just go to the corner store and buy yourself this for just 35 cents. The problem was you had to have one of these at home. This was $50. And that doesn't sound like much, but people only made 5 cents an hour back then, so that was quite an undertaking. But 35 cents, you'd pick it up, you would take it how they started. This was the original medium. There you go. Okay? All right, so this was $18.98, and like I said, $50. The next one over here, this came up 4 years later. But look at this one. Look what he did here. A little portable. You could take this to school, to work, to church, any place where you needed music. I call this the original iPod. And just think, if you took this thing to a party and you had enough of those blue wax cylinders, you could be a DJ. All right, this is really easy to see how it works. So I'm going to show, I can demonstrate for you. But I can lift this part of it away, and this, here's the blue wax cylinder, the same as over there. And you ladies missed it, but this round circle here is called a diaphragm. The diaphragm vibrates with the sound of our voice. And underneath it is a little tiny needle. So when this thing vibrates, and it vibrates because it's sitting in the little grooves, and it vibrates that, it creates the sound which comes out this way. Converse to that, if you talk in here and had a blank one, the needle would put the markings on here. So it's both ways. So I'm going to play this. So I release the spring which makes this turn. I take, and all I have to do is put the needle down. Whatever the needle touches, everything is recorded. Whatever's underneath it, it will play. Big difference.
Talk about moonlight, in there you find moonlight. You have your sweetheart by your side. You have no one near you, I know that with
All right, I heard enough of that one. Okay, but it gives you an idea how the thing works, right? So this was 1902, and this you could have bought for $20. Right? Coming down. But look at this baby. This, which probably most of us have seen these in people's houses. This was $250. And if you had one of these, boy, you were doing well. But something else happened. This was 1906. But something else happened. Look, instead of the blue wax cylinder, we now had what we old people call a record. Right? I always kid the kids. I said, I think you kids call it a CD or something. They don't know what this is. And even the kids don't know what a CD is anymore. All right, but he did not invent this record format. It was invented by the Victor Talking Record Company, which later merged with RCA, became known as RCA Victor. And he didn't think this was great or anything. He thought that the fidelity was actually better, which it was, in that round cylinder. But he realized that waxed cylinder, you could go and break it real easy. So he made this out of unbreakable material. And you can see how thick this is. We cut one just so you can see how thick that is. Right? It was very unbreakable.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm going to play this for you over here. But you have to understand the technology, basically, this diaphragm and a horn. Here's the diaphragm, and underneath there's the little needle. And just as I put the horn here and it got real loud, look what he did. He took the horn and he wrapped the horn around. The horn's on the inside of the box. See? Good, nice though, right? It's on the inside. So I'm going to play this for you. I'm going to put the needle down right about here. And he also added a volume control. Look inside. That was the big advance of the year. Okay, so that's the phonograph.
Is that
What year was that?
This was 1902.
Oh no, the rotations per minute.
Oh,
that
yeah, it was
70?
80.
80.
It was 80, okay, so.
Yeah. He did it.
When did 78 then came
Yeah,
later?
I don't really know the date, but he purposely made his different than everybody else's, so
Okay.
that you couldn't play this on that, that
Right.
on this. You know,
So
purposely.
this is 80
It's
RPM,
80 RPM. Yeah.
not 78.
Yeah. You could use it, but there's other differences too. The technology was his needle went up and down, the other ones went side to side. You know, there were little difference like that. Anyway, so that's the story here. So he was now all this all happened up in West Orange at his second location, and up in West Orange, his house was there, and he had these little children, small children, and they were home playing with one of those flip books where, you know, you flip the pages of the book and you could, it looks like an animation is moving. And he saw that and he thought to himself, hey, I could make a motion picture camera to do the same thing. So he went into his laboratory and he builds this wooden box. And he puts a lens on the front of it to focus an image down on film. He puts a door on the side to close it with a big handle to move the film. Well, he had everything he needed, but he had no film for his camera. But he had a good friend by the name of George Eastman of Eastman Kodak. So he goes to see George and says, George, I need some of your film. Now, George had just invented the soft film, like negative film. Prior to George, all photography used to be done on glass plates. So George invents this new soft film. I need some of your film. He says, sure, I'll give you whatever you need. He says, it's 70 millimeters wide. Oh, he says, that's too big. Could you cut that in half for me and make it 35 millimeters? Have you heard 35 millimeter film? Well, that's where that came from. So he put the 35 millimeter film into his new camera. He closes the door. He starts to crank the handle. And all of a sudden, one of his men just sneezes right in front of him. And he caught it on film. He caught the first thing ever recorded on film. And thankfully, he had the forethought to immediately upload that to YouTube.
Yeah, right.
And if you go to YouTube, type in Thomas Edison, you will see the sneeze. The very first thing ever recorded, which is amazing. So anyway, so he started.
Everything is on YouTube.
Yeah, and that is true. And it is really true. But so it was that started the whole industry of movie making. And so up in West Orange, he built himself a movie studio. He called it the Black Mariah. It's still there. You can go and see it. And what this was a building about the size of this. He put the building on a pivot and put wheels on the corners and a little track around it. And so inside was a stage where the actors would act. And over here, he opened the roof so that the sunshine would come in and bathe the stage with sunshine, with light. And so the actors could act and he would film, and all of a sudden, when they realized that the sun had moved, they would all go outside and they would move the building around on the wheels. And keep
More
it,
lights.
keep it in view of the lights. And so it was a very creative way, but he did a great job. Well,
Yeah, spotlight.
and he did that for a while, and until he decided that he wanted to go outside to do some outdoor scenes. So the next thing is he moves his operation, his filming operation, up to Fort Lee, New Jersey, where the George Washington Bridge comes in on this side. That's Fort Lee, New Jersey. So he went there because he was going to make movies. Now, if you were going to make movies, where would you get movie stars from? Maybe from Broadway?
New York, yeah.
Yeah, so it was easier to get people from Broadway to Fort Lee than it was Broadway to bring them out to West Orange, which was quite a trip. So he brought them in there. And they would start acting and whatever, and they were making films. Well, when the world heard that Thomas Edison, you know, this the big inventor, was now in Fort Lee making movies, 27 filming companies opened up in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And they were all making films and all that. Well, they're all gone today, with the exception of one, Universal Studios, down in Florida. Right? There you go. So they're all gone after all of that. Anyway, so he kept working on these, and he kept improving it. And motion pictures, so, you know, nobody had ever seen motion pictures, so he went out there with his camera. He went to a boxing match, he went to a baseball game, he went to ballerina, you know, and then he opened up a place in New York City on the street level, you know, and opened up the doors, and you go inside, and they had these machines, and you would put coins in, and you'd have to look in the viewfinder, you know, like this, and you know, and there were people lined up around the block because they had never seen motion pictures. They all wanted to see them. So, you know, if you lost your place or you ran out of change, you were done. You know, that was it. Next. And so people were putting that money in there, and that's where he coined pay-per-view. Pay-per-view.
Pay-per-view.
And so anyway, so they were doing this, they were watching these movies until some lady said, but Mr. Edison, why do we have to look in this machine? Couldn't we make this so that we could all see it together on the wall up somewhere? Well, he didn't think that was so important, but he found out there were two men working on this idea in France, the Lumiere brothers, and they invented a projection system for his film. Well, the problem was that he bought the patent from them, by the way, gets it back to New Jersey, opens it up, and finally you're only able to project this thing 2 feet. This is not much of a projector. Well, what the real problem was is in the back was this little tiny bulb. Well, that wasn't bright enough, but here's a guy who knew all about bulbs, right? So he replaced the bulb with a real bright bulb with a mirror behind it, and now he was able to project a movie 40 feet away. So he takes his contraption, he goes to New York City, right on where Macy's is today, on 34th Street. There was an old vaudeville theater, and he went in there and said, everybody knew his face, everybody knew Thomas Edison. He says, "Could I try a new invention here in your theater?" "Sure, Mr. Edison." So he set it up. He set his projector up between 2 aisles. They closed the curtains and they hung a bed sheet. And they turned it on and projected it up 40 feet. And that was the invention of the motion picture theater, just the way we know it today, with the soft chairs and the big screen. And it was the month after that that he invented popcorn. Nah, I'm only kidding. Yeah, somebody said that's where he made all his money, at $7.50 a tub. So there you go. There's so much more I could tell you. There's one last story I guess. I'll tell you this book. There was a mine up in Ogdensburg, New Jersey, and there it was an iron mine, and they asked him if he could help to figure out how to separate the iron from the sand and gravel. And he said, "Sure." And he came up with this idea. Here's a container with yellow sand and iron filings. And he took a magnet and was able to separate the iron from it. You see it? Like that. So what happened was they actually, up in Ogdensburg, they used to crush all this stone down to a fine powder, and it would come down the conveyor belt, and they would go like that, try to pick out the iron. Very difficult, very difficult. So Edison came up with the idea. He built this physical thing up there in Ogdensburg, but this is what he put on the patent application. And they would pour this granulated sand and mix up top, and he put a big magnet on the side, and when the stuff went through, anything that was magnetic would get pulled over by the magnet and would fill up a bucket. Anything that wasn't magnetic would go straight down, doing the same thing as what this thing does. Separating, the iron is separated. Okay? So there you go. That's how he got into the mining business, thinking, boy, that was easy. And so what he didn't realize is that the business was very difficult, very competitive. Here's a piece of natural iron. You can feel this. Feel this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, iron ore out of the ground. Or feel it? Yeah. See? That's its natural state.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty.
So when he was doing this, he was working real hard to produce this iron, and then all of a sudden they found that there was a vein of iron in Minnesota that was so pure. It was called the Mesabi Range. It was so pure that they were taking the iron out of the ground. They could build cars with it immediately. It wasn't powder like this, so he knew that he had to close it up, and that was the end of that. So he closed up his iron mine, losing $4 million in those days' money, and finally, 3 or 4 years later, he got an idea. He said, all that sand and gravel that they've been grinding up for years, piles and piles and piles of it. He got another idea, opened up another company. He called it the Edison Portland Cement Company. And he started to mix that piles of sand with concrete, mixed Portland cement, and they put it into 80-pound bags, just the way you could buy one today, in an 80-pound bag. And he got his very first contract to sell his concrete. He sold 150,000 bags, and they built Yankee Stadium.
And he made more than
And he got,
$4 million.
he didn't get it quite on that one, but his second big contract, they built the Panama Canal.
Oh, okay.
He did okay.
I wonder how many billions he made.
Was he the first one to put the sand and the cement in a bag?
I don't know that for
He
a
may not have
fact,
invented it, but he knew he
but
had
he
all
knew
that
that was
sand.
the way to do it. I think he picked the 80-pound bag because it was convenient, but that's the way they still sell them. 80, they sell them 80s and 40s.
Right.
Yeah. And by the way, this tower that you see outside was made mainly of concrete. And and it was mainly done that way because of his involvement in concrete. This is a photograph from when they did the renovation of it over the past 2 years. It was renovated, and the concrete was going to pop because of the water leakage behind it and so forth. But before I go, the last part of this thing is about the tower itself. The tower itself there's a light bulb on the top of this. There's a photograph here of a man standing next to the light bulb. The tower is about 100, I forgot the real number, 160 feet. But this light bulb was made by Corning Glass. They made it because inside, on the top of the tower, they put Edison's bulbs, which would light up every night. But the heat from the bulbs, they were afraid that when it rained or ice or snow, that would crack the glass. And so Corning Glass volunteered to make the shell. They did this in 1937, and it was really to advertise their brand new product called Pyrex. So Pyrex, you could heat it and cold, and there it was. Hey, if it's okay for Edison, it's got to be okay. Yep.
And now they're more
And so
popular
sure,
and known
so now
by
everybody-
their Gorilla Glass, which are all over our phones.
Yeah, the Gorilla
The
Glass
Gorilla
made by
Glass
Corning?
made by Corning.
Was that Corning? I didn't know that. Okay.
Gorilla
I didn't know.
Glass?
Gorilla Glass, yeah. Yeah, you can hammer it and it doesn't break. Yeah. Amazing, huh?
What's the
Okay.
deal with the sock?
What's that?
Sock over here.
The sock.
Oh, that's, yeah,
That's
that's
a,
not,
that
Oh,
is-
that was the.
Yeah, that's, the story on that one is, let me tell you, Edison was very hard of hearing. You guys missed this part. He was very hard of hearing. He had no hearing in this ear, and he was down to 30% in this ear when he died. And here's a guy that invents the phonograph, right? Well, his hearing was so bad that when he was working on this, he couldn't really hear it very well. And so he would bite it, and so he could feel the vibrations go up his bones. And he was in a room filled with all these other men, and he was a perfectionist, you know, he had this thing playing, and he was tweaking it and tightening and doing this, and it was driving everybody nuts, playing it over and over and over, until one of his men said to him, "Mr. Edison, please, put a sock in it." That's what that expression means. Put a sock in it.
Oh,
They couldn't stand the noise anymore. Put a sock in it. There you go. All right.
All the men that worked for him.
Yes.
How did he know that they wouldn't leave him and take his idea before the patent?
He didn't know that. He didn't know that at all, but they were very dedicated to him. Some of the men that started with him ended with him.
Okay.
They put up they called themselves the Edison Pioneers. They all contributed, and they put up the first tower outside, which was like a radio tower, you know, with the steel bars, and that came down in a storm. But they contributed to that, so they really loved it. I mean, he was a tough guy to work for. Let me tell you, his house was down our street, just to the left, and that's where him and his family lived. And not across the street directly, but down just a little bit, there was a boarding house. There's a photograph over there, the Sarah Jordan boarding house. Now she would put the men up, the single men. She had this nice sized house. There were 3 or 4 bedrooms. She had 3 or 4 beds. And when they first started, there were 7 men here working with him. And as they grew, it grew up as far as 80 men working in that. Well, that house got overfilled, and she had 5 men to the bed. I wouldn't want to stay in that bed, but 5 men to the bed. Anyway, I forgot why I was telling you the story. What was the question?
Dedication.
Oh, the dedication. So anyway, he would go home at night, and he'd walk down the hill and go to his house. But if he thought of something in the middle of the night, he'd walk up there, he'd knock on the everybody back to work. That's the dedication. And they'd come back to work, and they would work until they figured out what's. And they loved him so much, and he would drive them, and they would laugh, and they would have coffee and stuff in the back of the laboratory. They even had this photograph over there. There was a guy that played the organ. He had an organ back, so he would sing along. He tried to make them as happy as possible. There's a pond in the middle of this 36-acre property, and he used to, on real hot days, he would take the men down there to kill some time. They'd go fishing in the lake, and so he tried to treat them the best that he could. Across the street is where the electric train, where he put the electric train. Well, when they built the electric train, they were trying to make it go faster and faster, and the guys were on that thing. He'd make it go so fast. That guys were falling off, and they were having fun. He was trying to keep it light and lively. But most of them, every time when they worked really hard at something, he would put their name on the patent, in addition to his, so that they would get some sort of royalties. And that's what I guess pulled them all together.
Okay.
So many people had their names on these patents. He was always number one, but a lot of people. When he knew you were working hard, that's how he paid you. I would like to take you outside to the tower. Would you like to see it?
Yeah.
It's not a great deal to see, but it's worth seeing since you're here. Let me go get the key for the tower.
Okay.
Right out the back door. You ladies did. The tower spews music because that's where the phonograph was invented. And on the very top, you see the light bulb that I was just telling you up in the corner of the glass. Don't want to close the door. Now this big tower, but this was called the Eternal Light, and it was put on this exact spot because this is where his laboratory was. And this is the spot basically where he turned on the bulb and it lasted for 14 hours. So this is the spot where it was created. The bulb was actually invented in 1879, but of course this was not put in here until 1938 when this tower was built on top of it. Okay, but this light has been on for 75 years or so. But it's not a real light bulb. It's a hunk of glass. But the real light source is inside here in the back. And what they did is they put 6 headlights from a Model T Ford to shine up on that light, and it comes through the glass. So that's how it was done.
glows.
Yeah, it's just glowing.
So in case one light goes out,
That's
there's another light.
It's eternal. So if it starts to get dark, we go in there, we look, and we change the bulb.
Change the bulb downstairs.
Yeah, yeah. So that's it. Though. So it was just because of this is where it all happened. I mean, you hear the music right on the same spot. This is where everything happened. All his 400 inventions came out of this building. 400, and they were fabulous inventions. I mean, that electric train and all that all came out of here. Yeah. Very
It's
famous.
always the light bulb. It's always like the
Yeah, the light and the phone and the phonograph
and the phonograph.
Yeah, but there's so many other things. You alluded to his tattoo machine. He hated that because he invented the electric pen. And the electric pen had like a needle that would go in and out, like a sewing machine needle.
Right.
And he put that on, took a piece of wax paper like you wrap a sandwich in, and he took that and he was able to write on it, and it would puncture holes through it. So he would write like this, and this thing very rapidly would make holes. And he put that on it, he inked up a board. He put the stencil down on top of that, put a piece of white paper on top of that, and then he rolled it with a roller, and the ink would go through those little holes, and he peeled off a copy of the original. He invented the Xerox machine right here in this building. So
Like a copier.
the copy machine, yeah. So, but he called it the mimeograph. Mimi to mimic to copy. the mimeograph machine.
Like the old mimeograph.
Yeah, like we had them in school.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that was it. That was an offshoot of that. That's all it is. Yeah. Yeah. He had a very fertile mind. Okay. So that's it. I'm sorry there's nothing more to show you. But this.
Thank you, Chuck. That was great.
Yeah, it's time for me to move on and get a job.
And give me one of them.
So I'm gonna go to that new
Compass.
railroad that went between
That one.
your one.
Mike Tyson used to direct the pointers.
And Detroit. And so, sure enough, next day he went down to job to sell newspapers and candy to the travelers. And so he would walk up and down selling newspapers and candy. It was a good job for a welcome boy, right? And so what happened was they would go to farmland. And all the farmers would have their wares from this way.
Okay.
The fruits and vegetables and all that stuff.
Where's the
So he
DVD?
got an idea. He said, hey, I'm gonna buy some of the fruits and vegetables and try to sell that. So sure enough he did. And he started making no money with the fruits and vegetables and he was going to so that was pretty good. He made a lot of money. Yeah,